Welcome Internet, psychoanalytic talk. And today we're going to be talking about the differences between delusions and fantasies. Fantasies both with an F and with a PH. If you're unfamiliar with the difference, I made a video a couple of months ago about that very notion. So basically we're going to start by explaining what is a delusion. A delusion at the very core is when an individual loses reality testing. What does that mean? Well, it's a moment where the individual is going to detach themselves from reality. They're going to lose the connection between themselves and the real world. That delusion can have many shapes, many forms, and many apparatus. The idea is that it's a belief that is so powerful, so strong within the individual that they cannot put it into perspective. They cannot reason with it. It takes the whole space, the whole mind of the individual is basically aimed towards that delusion. That delusion is incredibly meaningful for the individual experiencing it. So how do we explain it in psychoanalysis? Well, very fundamentally, that delusional belief is there as a neo-reality. So what is a neo-reality? Well, in psychoanalysis, we believe that psychotic people, when they break down into psychosis, basically are experiencing a state of complete dread and terror where everything becomes meaningless. There's no more meaning to the real world. The symbolic order, if we were to go for Lacanian interpretation, makes no more sense, neither does the imaginary. So therefore what is happening for the individual is that the real, what fragments the mind, what is anti-mind is occurring. I.e. the person is at real risk of losing who they are to this meaninglessness. So what is going to happen is that the individual is going to, in an emergency, create a neo-reality, as I said. So therefore a new reality on top of the first one, in order to try and make sense of all this meaninglessness. However, because it's built in an emergency and in a moment where the mind is completely fighting for its survival, the meaning is massive. It's something that's solely directed to the individual, and people are excluded from it. It's a meaning that only has value for the individual that holds it, and not for the others. And if you were to judge from an outsider's perspective, we might say it's of bad quality because it's not shareable. The individual cannot just share this belief because it's so massive, so powerful, and so total. That's a very important point, is that sometimes delusions impact the whole spectrum of the life of the individual, both their professional, personal, familial, societal, and so on and so forth, aspects of their lives. Therefore, the delusion is incredibly massive, and they cannot reason with it. It's not something where you can compromise and say, okay, I believe this, but I'm going to let it go for a couple of hours and do something else. It's something that basically takes all of the space in the mind of the individual, at least at the very beginning of the psychotic episode, if the individual is at their first psychotic episode. So, very fundamentally, what you have to understand is that for the individual in the delusion is true. It's the ultimate form of truth that they have found, or that has self-imposed. That would be a better way of phrasing it, is that the individual feels that has basically come down upon them. That realization is absolute truth, and therefore they owe themselves to respect that absolute truth. However, it's going to be unshareable to the others, and it's going to be detached from reality, meaning that basically it doesn't fit into our common and collective understanding of what reality is. So in this moment, the individual is going to basically be in a fight for their psychic survival. And as such, that ultimate meaning is often one that comes with a lot of different beliefs. It can be a belief that they are somehow special, selected by God or the state to perform a mission, a very sacred mission, but yet a very vague one. It can be the interpretation of everything that's going on, like for example, if let's say we are eating mortadella, a form of meat, the individual might see mortadelle, think mortel, i.e. mortel, being to die, therefore they're not going to eat them after that because that would mean to die and they can't die, and so on and so forth. So you can see that it basically takes the whole space and the person is utterly, completely convinced about it. It's no longer a set of compromises. And so basically that's it for the delusion. In regards to fantasy is quite different, as it's also something of the mind, a construct. But in the case of fantasy, it's not about an absolute truth. The individual can see it as a fantasy. It doesn't take the whole space and the whole mind. It's in a way they're very different because even though both can have similar intricacies, for example, let's say the question of megalomania, i.e., an elation of self-esteem and feeling that one's the best and absolutely right. In the terms of delusion, it's going to be massive. It's going to be there. The person is going to be convinced. In the case of a fantasy, is that the person might daydream about it, might think, "Oh, I'm so good at this," or "I'm so great at that." Might imagine things. How can I say? Might basically run fictitious scenarios in their minds and they know it's completely fictitious, but they still do it because it's very pleasurable, in a way that they organize their own struggles, their own peripeties, how they're gonna overcome them, and so on and so forth. It is the fantasies, in a way, are chosen. The individual chooses to daydream or to fantasize about what they're fantasizing about. They invest in it. It's pleasurable. It's not scary. It's not destructive, as the delusions can be, because the delusions, even if they're a way of surviving psychically, at least according to psychoanalysis, they're very costly. The individual feels distorted by them, destroyed, and it's as saving them as it is hurting them. In the case of fantasies, they're not that hurtful or frustrating. They only become hurtful if, let's say, they go against the fabric of society. For example, I'm thinking it's much less so now, but 50, 60, 70 years ago, if one had a homosexual fantasy, let's say, that might have been ego dystonic. The person would have looked at themselves and said, "Oh, but I'm not like that. I can't admit that's fantasy because it goes against the fabric of society." Therefore, fantasies can create a mental conflict, right? It's not to say that they're all good, but that mental conflict isn't to the extent of psychosis, in which the conflict is not between the self and the unconscious, but rather between the individual and basically the system, society, and reality. Therefore, the conflict is not at the same level. In terms of fantasy, also, there's this pleasure aspect. Delusions don't seem to have, or at least not completely. They're both pleasant and disruptive, whereas the fantasies are often more pleasurable, and what becomes disruptive is as if the fantasy meets reality. So that's very important. The delusion, if it meets reality, does not really have an impact on the delusion. The delusion changes or alters itself because it's not meant to go hand in hand with reality, therefore it changes. Whereas the fantasy, if it basically connects with reality, can be incredibly disruptive. Why? Because not all fantasies are necessarily ones that we want to act upon. For example, let's say someone that hates their superior or their boss at their work. They might fantasize of running them down or gunning them down, right? It's a fantasy, and that's fine. It's perfectly okay. But if ever the boss is gunned down or basically killed, then the fantasy meets reality, and that creates a problem with the mind, because the mind starts thinking, "Oh, it's because we had the fantasy that this happened. It's because we had the fantasy," and it creates a form of linking between reality and the fantasy, which reactivates magical thinking of the child, of i.e., if you think it, if you believe it, therefore it's going to happen. And that's incredibly complicated to deal with for the average neurotic, because often fantasies are part of the inner world and they're not meant to pour out in the outside world, and if they do, they hurt and they're disruptive because they're not really meant to do so. But you might say, but if you have, let's say, the fantasy of having a family, and then you have a family, it's not traumatic. And you'd be right, because that fantasy is meant to go into the outside world, but a lot of fantasies aren't. And this is going to bring us nicely to the fantasies with a PH, because what you have to understand is that at the very core of ourselves, the daydreams we have, the fantasies with an F, are conscious ones, but there is an unconscious level of fantasy, which is very much more massive, powerful, and also repressed. Those fantasies are, for example, the Oedipus complex, or the merger with mother, or the going back into the womb, or basically everything else psychoanalysis has postulated. These fantasies are, in essence, much closer to the delusion, but, and this is a big but, they get severely repressed by the mind. The mind pushes them away. That doesn't mean that they don't have a force, because they still have a binding power within the mind. But being conscious of it, that's not really something that's going to happen. Therefore, those, for example, those fantasies of going back to the womb are going to be pushed out. And what's going to have an echo is, for example, loving to go to the swimming pool, loving to be in water, loving to be in one's bed, with basically sheets and plenty of containing basically, I don't have the word, but you get me, what's on the bed. So basically that containment aspect of it, the sheets of the bed, is going to be reassuring for the individual. And that's basically the echo with the womb fantasy. But it's not the womb fantasy per se, it's an echo. So therefore fantasies with a PH are still very there, and in essence they have the same level of power than delusions, but they never come back. Whereas the delusions are a way of those fantasies of coming back. And in France, Lacan had a very interesting way of speaking about psychotic individuals, saying that their unconscious was explicit. So the French saying is l'inconscient à ciel ouvert, meaning unconscious as a clear sky, i.e. it's evident, everyone can see it, and so on and so forth. So one could make an argument that in the case of psychosis, because the meaning of the outside world has collapsed, the meaning of secondary nature of you basically repress your own megalomania, your own bad traits, your own desires, and in psychosis it re-emerges because there's not that framework. So the unconscious fantasies basically are coming back, but unconscious fantasies with a PH, right? And it's not just that they're coming back, there's an added layer that they become fully true. I was thinking about magic thinking, right? Previously, well, it's as if the magic thinking went full force, and that's basically the delusion. It's when the patient becomes convinced that basically magic thinking is real, and that they have an impact, or that the world has an impact on them. Therefore, there's no longer a difference between the self and the outside world. Both are combined. The self englobes the outside world, whereas in fantasy, the self remains fully separate from the outside world. Therefore, there's a real difference between in and out, inside of oneself and outside of oneself. Delusions don't have that. Delusion is basically a form of hybrid between in and out. There's no more difference between what's inside of us and what is outside of us, all merged together. This is an incredibly frightening state for the individual, and therefore they have to protect themselves with this delusion. And basically the neurotic, or the person that has those fantasies, does not have to, because they're pretty sure of their sense of security and that their fantasies remain fantasies, and that they will not pour out, and something of themselves, of their inner world, will remain in their inner world. Whereas for the psychotic, that distinction is much more fragile and needs a lot of help to be consolidated, to be there, to be able for them to remake a difference between the outside world and the inner world. A difference and a confusion that's even worsened by, for example, hallucinations, in which they will see, hear, smell, or perceive something that's not there. So you can see that how hard it can be for psychotics to make a distinction between in and out, or between inner world and outside world. Whereas for the neurotic, that distinction remains very steady. Basically, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.